Good. So just a quick word about the history of the series, and then we'll get going with our last formal introduction. We started this about, 2008, so 16 years ago. It was inspired by our then Dean of Arts and Sciences, Grady Ballinger, who may be here today. He often comes. Is he here? I don't know. And a donor whose brother had been instrumental in Holocaust education in New York State, who it hasn't been endowed in his name for a while, but he got this, they got this series going. And since that time, we've had really cutting edge scholarship, largely in history, but also in cultural studies and literature, religious studies, archaeology, political science, helping introduce the whole community to major questions and problems in Holocaust studies, but also trying to see how we can learn from those kind of scholarly discussions and maybe apply that to the present day. That's been kind of the idea behind the series. Some of the talks have included Christopher Browning, who is one of the most important scholars of Holocaust studies since really the 1970s, who presented his new book on the interactions between Ukrainian, Polish, German, and Jewish individuals in one Polish ghetto. This is about 12 years ago now, and that was a very cutting edge book, and it taught us a lot about why people make the decisions they do in certain contexts. We had Atina Grossman give a wonderful talk on work in progress about how, including her own family, many Jewish refugees in the 40s fled through the Soviet Union and Central Asia and the Middle East in order to escape the Holocaust. And she kind of brought those stories to light. Last year, we had Dirk Moses, some of you may have been here, talking or problematizing the concept of genocide, which given our, look what's going on in the world today, our inability or unwillingness to intervene really made us reflect on whether genocide is the best lens through which to make decisions about political and legal interventions in ethnic cleansing and mass killing everywhere. And as Dean Hill points out, we couldn't have a more timely scholar and topic than we have today, given the fact that even though we're in a state that officially promotes Holocaust education, there is an ongoing debate, not only in the United States, but in Britain and elsewhere, Germany, about whether LGBTQIA individuals generally, and specifically whether trans individuals were victims then or now of oppression, right? Including J.K. Rowling, who's coming at it from a progressive perspective. So it's not just a right or left thing. There's this real question out there. And I hope the lecture today will help everyone think about the way that there are other victims of the Holocaust and why that's important, not just historically, but in a contemporary context. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Carmen Palmer. Dr. Palmer is my colleague in religious studies, and she will give the formal introduction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurlander. And it's so wonderful to see everybody here this evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce this year's annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture speaker, Dr. Jennifer Evans. Dr. Evans is professor of history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where she has been teaching and conducting research since 2001. Her areas of teaching and research span 20th century social history, Germany and East Central Europe, the history of sexuality, comparative nationalisms, Cold War, national identity, and everyday life. Dr. Evans received her PhD from SUNY Binghamton in 2001. Her scholarly agenda is impressive and rigorous. In addition to numerous co-edited volumes, peer-reviewed articles, and book chapters, monographs include Life Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin, published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2011. The Queer Art of History, Queer Kinship After Fascism, published with Duke University Press in 2023. and Holocaust Memory in Digital Mediascape, co-written with Megan Lundrigan and Erica Fagan, recently published with Bloomsbury Press. Her careful and articulate work with method, such as that of kinship as method, is helpful for thinking broadly with other and related scholarship. I also note that Dr. Evans marks the true spirit of the model of a teacher scholar, which Stetson admires as well, in that co-authors Lundrigan and Fagan are former students of hers. How Dr. Evans even has time to be here this evening, I do not know. She is also presently working on a number of forthcoming publications, including the Routledge Global History of the Third Reich with Dr. Eric Kurlander. So congratulations to this forthcoming endeavor to you both. Dr. Evans's scholarship is impactful and well regarded, evidenced by the numerous awards and grants received in the pursuit of these endeavors. Most recently, the 2023 Konrad Adenauer Research Prize, awarded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I will also note that Dr. Evans is recipient and primary investigator of a highly prized Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC, Insight Grant, named Populist Publics in 2019, which was an ongoing 5-year digital project on memory, populism, and misinformation in the Canadian social media scape. A recent update on the site, as I was looking about, includes news of a panel chaired by Dr. Evans on anti-Semitism and online hate held at the Center for Jewish History in New York. Professor Evans has supervised numerous PhD and master's level students. Thanks to Evans's guidance, these former students have also achieved scholarly accolades of their own, including research publication and information dissemination. So with that, we here at Stetson University also look forward to being transformed by your scholarship this evening on the topic, the Third Reich's Other Victims, Queer Identity and Holocaust Memory After Fascism. So thank you very much, Dr. Evans.
Great, wow. Just making sure everything works. Put this down a little. I'm short. Let's see, I am clicking. The escape button. Oh yeah, that's right, no worries. Perfect, awesome, thank you so much. Wow, I mean, that was such a warm, such a wonderful introduction, and I'm just really proud to be here, and I'm just so happy to see so many people take time out of their day, out of their evening to make their way here, and I really appreciate the effort. I'd like to thank Stetson University and the organizers of the Holocaust Memorial Lecture for this invitation to speak to you this evening, and for sponsoring this event, for framing it in the way that your dean has, which I take very seriously, and I'm grateful. I'd like to thank the many people who made sure that my travel here went smoothly, including Dr. Kurlander, Caitlin Alvarado, and Deborah Tate. There's a lot of people, as you heard, behind the scenes that make events like this happen. And I had the wonderful opportunity to meet with some of Stetson's own students this afternoon, which is just icing on the cake. So I want to talk to you today about how it is that something that occurred 70 years ago plus in Germany and in the German-occupied lands has been taken up as part of a global struggle for rights and recognition. I'm going to focus on the building of the Berlin Memorial to Homosexuals Persecuted by the Nazis. That's the official title. The result of a long and arduous battle to recognize so-called other victims of the Holocaust. Now notice I didn't say gay and lesbian victims. As you'll soon hear, there was a huge debate around precisely this, about who was victimized by the regime and whose experiences and lives should be recognized by the state. And because history is never simple, never straightforward, and half the time it's not even really very easy, this debate unleashed a whole set of questions about how much Germany and the wider world has learned from this watershed moment of extreme violence in the middle of the 20th century. So my talk is going to ask you to think with me about how this history is represented for a national and also for an international audience, where we still find ourselves in some places, maybe more than others, wrestling with the fundamental question of how to do right by the victims of existential violence and fascism. So I'm going to do this by asking you to think about the differences between memory and history, memory which French thinker Pierre Nora characterized as ongoing, evolving, and contemporary, which serves the purpose of today, versus, say, history, which is also a reconstruction, but which is an anchor upon which to build long-term judgment. Does the memorial in Berlin represent the history or the memory of persecution? And how well does it do this? How does it fit into the larger memory of the Holocaust? And finally, what does it tell us about the gaps and the fissures in German and perhaps even our own coming to terms with the brutal history of the Nazis and the Third Reich and its implications for how we live our lives today? So historical geographers have taught us that a sense of place is made when the official meanings envisioned in the grand designs of planners, of architects, and of government officials rub up against the everyday tactics of ordinary people in staking their own claims to what certain spaces represent in public consciousness. When the space in question is imbued with national importance, like a memorial site, existing social cleavages often become really apparent. And we just have to think about the debates surrounding Confederate monuments to get a sense of how charged these debates really are. So the discussions that ensue can be unpleasant and they can be acrimonious, but they are also of tremendous use in getting us to think about how the past surfaces in how we talk about present day concerns. The discord generated in 2006 by an initiative to commemorate homosexual victims of National Socialism provides an interesting case in point. It illustrates how activists and historians, politicians, and city planners, and readers of the international queer media helped forge a space for queer place in today's Berlin. The design competition put the question of other victims of the Holocaust under the microscope as gay and lesbian activists debated how to represent the legacy of Nazi sexual and gender politics. The result was a full-scale debate and crisis of representation with unintended but important consequences. On the one hand, efforts to realize a memorial to homosexual victims in Berlin may have begun as a battle over history, over identity, and over social memory. But it ended by creating a more broadened foundation for claims to social justice, both in Germany and abroad. But on the other hand, as Holocaust commemoration expanded to recognize new persecuted groups, there remained significant blind spots and impediments, as we'll see, to a full reckoning with the Nazi past that really forces us all to think about our assumptions around how far we've actually come in tackling the legacy of homo and also transphobia. The debate around how to think about these other victims of the Third Reich and the continued persecution of these groups in Germany and elsewhere forces us to think about what is lost as well as gained as memorialization shifts from being about what happened in the past to struggles in the present. So in a way, I want you to listen and think about how important are Nazi crimes and how victims groups lay claim to not just remembrance, but to rights claims in the present, and what work remains to be done. So that's laying out a little bit of a roadmap about where we're going to go. So before we look at the debate around the memorial, let me first just map out a little bit more about the history of queer persecution itself and its place in Holocaust history. Although by now we're all quite familiar with the classification system used by the Nazis, the story of persecution is actually quite complicated. Among the first victims in Nazi Germany in the early 30s were political opponents, primarily communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to serve in the German army or take an oath of obedience to Hitler and were also targeted. The Nazis carried out a campaign against male homosexuality and persecuted gay men between 1933 and 1945 using paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. They claimed that sexual relations between men were a destructive vice that would lead to the ruin of the German people. Men accused of homosexuality were incarcerated in jails and prisons, and many later were remanded to concentration camps following the completion of their sentences. Though this is also an interesting part of the story, that there were many different paths through the carceral system in Germany, and it's not to say that every single person experienced this in exactly the same way. Not every queer man experienced the system in quite the same way. Nazi racial ideology targeted Jews most of all, but Roma and Black people were also persecuted. The Nazis viewed Poles and other Slavs as inferior and slated them for subjugation, for forced labor, and sometimes also death. Jewish prisoners received the most brutal treatment in Nazi concentration camps. Their experience was fundamentally different from all the other victims groups. And this is an important difference to bear in mind. That said, there was rampant homophobia within prisoner society itself. Queer victims often, unlike other victims who could forge relationships and networks that were sometimes essential to survival, queer victims, gay victims did not have the same license. They were not welcome into kinship, solidarity. And in fact, a lot of folks in the camps themselves thought that gay victims sort of deserved to be there as criminals, and that this was a mark of shame that they had to actually be in the same sort of space. And this kind of homophobia within the camps has actually lingered into the post-45 period, as you're going to hear in my talk today, but also, and it's an ugly part of this history, that researchers like Anna Haikova, one of our colleagues, has shown that there is a reluctance also among some survivors to really think about fellow survivors, some Jewish as well as gay, because of this sort of lingering homophobia. And one of the examples that she writes about is Freddie Hirsch, who was in Auschwitz and who had a long-term partnership with a man, and that part of his story doesn't really surface in the post-45 period because of this lingering stain. And she writes a book titled "People Without History Are Dust," that people without recognition of all aspects of their past are really lost to us in this really awful way. Lesbians and trans people experienced violence at the hands of the state, but often using different mechanisms than those that targeted gay men. There was no law against lesbianism, but women were denounced for their activities and especially for failing to live up to gender norms and expectations. They often wore the black triangle in the camps for asocials. Here on the slide, we see the images of Marta Halusa and Margaret Liu and their dog, which I think is kind of cute that they include. They were dance performers in Hamburg. They were lovers. They made plans to leave Germany when things got bad. They tried to, secure sort of exit visa under the name of their performance group, Pepita and Peter. Margot was Jewish, but married a Chinese national for safety, but he eventually denounced her as a lesbian and a prostitute and tried to divorce her. She and Martha went underground and managed to survive for a time, even distributing anti-Nazi propaganda flyers until they were arrested. Remarkably, they escaped detention and managed to stay underground until the Soviets liberated the city. And I say liberated in scare quotes because, as Atina Grossman has shown in the work that she's done, liberation by the Soviets was not necessarily liberating. They brought with them a massive wave of sexual assaults. The women moved to the UK in 1949, and they lived the rest of their days together, even buried in the same grave. My colleague Lori Marhofer writes about Ilse Totske, a musician, a flautist from Würzburg, who had tons and tons of friendships. Oops, that's the wrong person. Had tons and tons of friendships with local and area Jews. So unwilling was Ilse to give up these friendships that they were on the radar of the Gestapo. And after 1935, they were denounced repeatedly by neighbors for, again, refusing to end these friendships. At one point, they were caught trying to flee across the Swiss border with their Jewish girlfriend. Both of them were caught and sent back to Germany. The girlfriend was sent to Auschwitz, and Totske was sent to Ravensbrück, where they lived out their time, eventually passing away in 1987 and being recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous among nations. And as Lori Marhofer shows, even here, these histories of lesbianism and trans history are sometimes a little difficult to parse, considering we don't have Totske's own sort of sense of who they were. Was Totske, did they understand themselves to be a lesbian? Did they understand themselves to be something else? But this is another one of these interesting breadcrumbs of lives lived in extraordinary ways. Trans women like Liddy Backroff, on the other hand, were very clear with who they were. Liddy left behind memoirs and life writing that was very clear and very declarative that Liddy was a woman. Still, Liddy was persecuted under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code as a gay man involved in cross-dressing. Other people like Liddy might have surfaced on the radar with paragraph 183 for public indecency. Or someone like Fritz Kitzing, who I've worked on, was charged with paragraph 361, which was normally for folks found guilty of solicitation, and normally people who were born and assigned female at birth. So you can see already that the logic of how the Nazis dealt with lesbians and trans folks was a little bit all over the map. But what was clear was that gender nonconformism was something that put these folks in peril. And when I researched this case file, it's a Gestapo case file, one of the things that I always found super interesting, and you have to look for it, is the way in which Fritz Kitzing is either, terribly afraid, and understandably so, or in some small way resisting the power of the Gestapo. If you look at his hand in the left hand frame, you'll see that it's clenching ever so slightly at their skirt, which I think is an example of them trying to break from this from the stranglehold of this police mugshot. They were forced to wear the clothes that were found in their apartment under pain of reprisal. You can consult Fritz's case file at the US Holocaust Museum. It's made available, and especially was made available in the last few weeks when, again, J.K. Rowling, among others, argued that trans people did not surface in the archive. My colleagues Lori Marhofer, Bodhi Ashton, and Xavier Nun have found dozens of cases in the German police and court files of trans masculine and trans feminine victims, some like Liddy Backroff, pictured here again, who were unequivocal in their statements to the Gestapo and in life about who they were and who they believed themselves to be, in this case, a woman. So these stories are part of the historical register. They're part of the ongoing conversation. They are part of the work that historians are doing to unearth these histories. And these histories have been coming to light over the past 10, 20, and even 30 years. But these stories hadn't been part of the public conversation in Germany, and especially around public commemoration, until very recently. After close to a decade of lobbying for national recognition of Nazi crimes and emboldened by the state's commitment to the construction of Peter Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, queer activists in Germany felt a glimmer of hope with the 1999 National Parliament's announcement that the Federal Republic was morally obligated to commemorate the other victims of National Socialism in appropriate ways. Buoyed by this decision, the largest national gay rights organization, the Association of Lesbians and Gays, or the Schwulen- und Lesbenverband, or LSVD, submitted a formal petition for a queer monument. The conservative Green Party ruling majority in government ensured that the 2003 request would be taken up, adding that such a monument should honor the victims and the persecuted and the killed, should keep the memory of injustice alive, and serve as an ongoing symbol against intolerance, enmity, and the marginalization of gays and lesbians. Within 2 years, the Berlin Senate Administration for Science, Research, and Culture, Urban and Architectural Art tendered an open call for design submissions to be vetted first by the LSVD, together with the Initiative for the Commemoration of Homosexual Victims. And of the 127 submissions received from as far away as Tel Aviv, New York, and London, the field was narrowed down to 26 to be adjudicated by an 11-member prize committee consisting of the Berlin Senator for City Development, a prominent art historian, several curators and museum directors, 2 artists, and Gunter Dvorak, who represented the LSVD. By 2006, it looked as though the city, state, and nation was finally on its way to honoring homosexual victims of the Nazis. And especially motivated was the committee to think about the roughly 100,000 arrests and the incarceration of anywhere between 15 to 50,000 men in jails, prisons, and camps, where as many as 60% died from their treatment there. It might surprise you to know that although the statute of paragraph 175 was reformed in 1968 in East Germany and 1969 in the Federal Republic, it remained on the books in slightly altered form in West Germany, where courts in the post-war period have used Nazi-era case files as evidence in post-war trials. And indeed, some scholars have argued that there were more prosecutions in the post-war period than during the Third Reich. There was no effort to recognize queer victims in the post-war period in East Germany. If somebody could prove that they were a communist or if they were Jewish, they could appeal to be recognized as victims of fascism, but not for being queer. In West Germany, the sentiment of the mayor of the village of Dachau is revealing of the homophobia of the post-45 period. Hans Zauner told an interviewer in 1960, "You must remember that many criminals and homosexuals were in Dachau. Do you want a memorial for such people?" Germany was not ready in 1960 to think about homosexual persecution. But it was finally in the early 2000s, after decades of work by activist scholars on the ground and historians in the USA and Canada. And even here too, this story needs to be qualified. One of our amazing colleagues who's now retired, Jeffrey Giles, who taught at, I think it's the University of Florida, told me when I was just on my way through the ranks to be careful and not necessarily publish on this topic because I might not get tenure. And that was, not that long ago. The design submission for the memorial from Danish avant-garde artists Michael Elmgreen and Ingar Dragset was selected in January 2006, precisely because of the way its innovative design evoked the profound sense of grief and loss and alienation. The strikingly simple design, bearing a deliberate resemblance to the block-like stele of the neighboring Holocaust memorial, which is a textbook case of multi-directional memory, according to Michael Rothberg, how the history of the Holocaust aided other groups in realizing rights campaigns. It included a single-paned glass window behind which a continuously running black and white film was to play, depicting what one journalist termed 2 kissing boys in iron shirts. Given estimates that a full third of the population still found such kissing boys repulsive, these kisses were anything but harmless. Indeed, this design was lauded as art at its most provocative, and unfortunately would go on to be even more provocative when it came out a few years later that the fellow on the left here of the slide, the fellow kissing on the left, was actually a far-right nationalist from Denmark who was hired, as an actor without them having done adequate screening to find out his background. So that's another interesting little wrinkle in the story. So despite a few misgivings about the harsh modernism of the design, which differed quite significantly in style from monuments in Cologne and Frankfurt and Amsterdam, the committee seemed to have weathered the storm of public opinion. That is until May of that year, when the noted feminist and editor of the German version of Ms. magazine, which is called Emma, Alice Schwarzer, mounted a full-scale media attack. What was her reason? Her argument was that women were not just rendered invisible in the current design, they were actually written out of a shared history of persecution. And this is her on the right. Alice Schwarzer on the left is Romy Schneider, huge actor in Germany. Tried her hat at Hollywood, but I think I understood that her accent was too hard to transcend, and so she ended up coming back to Germany. Women were not just rendered invisible in the current design, they were written out of the shared history of persecution. In a coordinated article in the leftist newspaper Taz, cabaretist Marin Kreumann reiterated that lesbians continue to represent an invisible minority whose experiences failed then and now to resonate within majority culture. Using legal persecution as the frame for how we understand victimization, she argued, the whole of women's experience during the Third Reich simply fell away. So again, defining persecution as the Nazis did, there was no lesbians because lesbianism wasn't a crime under Nazi law, that paragraph 175 only criminalized male homosexuality, it fails to appreciate people who experience danger voiced in different ways, like Ilse Totzke. In the 2 years that followed the Emma action, 3 things happened. The history and nature of persecution itself was debated. The links between collective memory and artist endeavor were analyzed, and a compromise was ultimately reached, or depending on one's position, was actually forced. It resulted in important representational changes to the memorial. The debate turned on a few core issues. Alongside claims of the historic and ongoing occlusion of women from history and history making was the issue of whose task it should be to commemorate these stories. Whether the LSVD, the large lesbian and gay organization, spoke for all queer groups, or whether the historic enmity towards gays and lesbians was better left to small-scaled initiatives, like the ones that had occupied the scene in the former East Germany that were also intersectional with women and men and trans people working together. Finally, there was the issue of reigning myths within the queer community itself regarding the scope and scale of Nazi persecution, like the much critiqued notion of a Holocaust, of a targeted and wide-reaching persecution of gay men, deliberately underreported by a homophobic present-day society. Amidst these rising emotions, the memorial debate quickly traveled out of Germany and into the pages of gay and lesbian international news media. We see stories in the UK, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Israel, part of this kind of queer public sphere. So as not to see the project derailed completely, and perhaps to ensure their relevance as the premier gay and lesbian organization, the LSVD orchestrated a series of podium discussions to address the issues swiftly and judiciously, and most of all, in public. These two were covered extensively by the local Berlin papers, by the national media, and by the international queer press. In 2 of the sessions, the artists were even on hand to defend their design. "Why on earth would we want to exclude women?" they exclaimed. They were actually exasperated at the charge. The decision to fill the memorial's window with a film about 2 youths kissing was, in their mind, an attempt to portray a vision of intimacy and tenderness in the face of rampant homophobia. Accusing Emma editors of failing to perceive the way they evoked the gender of oppression in their design through the image of ebullient, youthful desire, As a salve against a violent and homophobic normative masculinity, Elm Green and Dragset went so far as to claim it was Schwarzer and her supporters who failed to recognize the feminist aesthetic motifs in their own design plan. And I mean, that's sort of like, a lot of things to unpack, and maybe it's something we could talk about in the Q&A. A month after they publicly defended their position, following a general membership meeting in October 2006, the LSVD posted a resolution on its website calling for much hope for solidarity between gays and lesbians in order to work collectively towards the realization of the memorial's originary purpose, to serve as a visible statement against intolerance, enmity, and isolation. This call for solidarity, though, was premised on a condition: that the artist's vision of an infinite loop of two men kissing be kept in the final design, both because this was adjudicated by jury and also because it conformed to the history of persecution more generally, a history that disproportionately affected men. Sensing that such a schism could undermine the entire effort, the LSVD called on the federal authorities, specifically the Minister for Culture and the Berlin Senate, to help find ways to better integrate lesbians into the artist's vision. So it sounds like a good plan, but this action actually had the effect of further angering the Emma Collective. Under the heading "Stop the Homo Monument," Schwarzer and her supporters wrote another missive, this time calling out the patriarchal dominance of the gay men in the movement and the lack of power of lesbians in positions of leadership. Their voices held resonance beyond the feminist magazine. A special issue of the major LGBTQ newspaper, the Siegessäule, or Victory Column in English, named after a Berlin-era landmark that also serves as one of the city's biggest cruising spots, very close to the Bundestag, showcased these opposing positions with members of the Gay and Lesbian Museum, the Schwules Museum, the initiative Remember the Homosexual NS Victims, and a former board member of the Foundation for Brandenburg State Memorials, arguing against the inclusion of lesbianism, and one single pro-Emma respondent. Although the question of lesbian marginalization seemed to garner minimal support in the local gay press, the position had managed to secure at least the eye and attention of one member of the European Parliament, who sent a letter to the chair of the Federal Cultural Commission demanding action. Having learned of the artist's reticence to reconceptualize the piece, Representative Lucy Gruner underscored that there is enough room in the planned memorial site for both sets of stories. She raised a simple idea: the addition of an information plaque outlining the shared but different timelines of historical and ongoing persecution, while reminding her federal colleagues that this issue had awakened European interest, which was a veiled reference to the EU's mandate of ensuring equality between the sexes. For this reason, she pleaded with them to safeguard that the exclusion of lesbian women would not be allowed to occur. In other words, how the different ebbs, flows, and experiences and legacies of Nazi persecution were to be remembered in Berlin has come to some extent about is to some extent about the historical record, but it has now taken on international importance as a matter of contemporary diversity and human rights policy and struggles. Feminist activism had succeeded in opening up a space for greater lesbian visibility. And by the end of 2007, several prominent Social Democratic and Green Party politicians joined members of the LSVD and Berlin's queer mayor, Klaus Wowereit, to formally request that the artists reconceptualize the monument's design to speak in some way to lesbian experience. And they conceded. The plan was to change the infinite loop of men kissing every 2 years and replace it first with a second film that focused on people reacting to people kissing, which was one step, and then a third film by the Israeli artist Yael Bartana, which featured several people kissing, several sensuous lesbian kisses against a backdrop of archival images of gay, lesbian, and even a little trans history. So trans persecution in the monument is there, not explicitly, but a hint of it is in the images. At a cost of roughly 600,000 euros, the memorial was finally unveiled by the Federal Minister of Culture, Bernd Neumann, in a ceremony attended by over 400 people in the spring of 2008. Both the controversy and the unveiling entered the international queer blogosphere through transnational subcultural networks and pathways. Already in 2007, the New York Gay City News reported on the cavernous divide between gays and lesbians. The lack of coalition building has affected gay and lesbian politics in Germany to the extent that advocacy is still very male-centered. An article in The Advocate titled "A Memorial of Our Own" underscored the importance of the elm green and drag set design to international queer identity politics. While a later article went a step further in placing the Berlin Memorial in conversation with other transnational queer commemorative cultures, like those which have resulted in memorials in Amsterdam, Sydney, and Tel Aviv. Even the small Pennsylvania Erie Gay News reported on the memorial in Berlin, calling special attention to the ongoing stigma German victims experienced after the war. The queer media engagement with the memorial demonstrates how pivotal the Nazi persecution of German homosexuals was and remained to gays and lesbians abroad. Indeed, almost every article cited its placement in close proximity to the Eisenman Memorial as a sign that injustices against gays and lesbians finally had acquired serious treatment in Berlin's memorial landscape. Along the same vein, they referenced that the federal government had sanctioned its construction. What began as a testament to German public memory had transcended the national orbit and was quickly taken up as a symbol of the historic mistreatment of gays and lesbians the world over. Building the memorial was greeted as an important step forward in recognizing past wrongs. But perhaps most importantly, it served as a rallying cry for ongoing human rights struggles. And in fact, it's often these stories were positioned in the newspapers next to stories about gay marriage, next to HIV stigma, showing that this was part of a particular historical moment. In this way, the building of the memorial aided in the materialization of queer memories of suffering, linking the German past to a transnational present. In cyberspace and among the readers of subcultural media, the memorial helped lend shape and form to a universalized set of common queer collective memories. The events in Berlin turned on the history of Nazi crimes. But in linking the memorial symbolically to the ongoing battle against marginalization and homophobia, the memories conjured up by the memorial helped bind international queers emotionally across national and temporal divides. In queering place in Berlin, not just in the sense of creating a space for a queer memorial, but in transcending state and nation, the memorial and the international reportage and the queer counterpublic constructed a kind of kinship based around the shared heritage and symbology of Nazi violence and its importance for contemporary queer identity. At the same time, these tensions and the fraught politics of commemoration suggest that queer kinship and solidarity, even in the face of common causes, is not easy. And it wasn't entirely inclusive either. While we certainly may celebrate efforts to recognize LGBTQ persecution as a breach of human rights, it is worth returning to this question of losses and gains in the quest to concretize a vision of queer consciousness in public memory, especially one that is rooted in identity politics and increasingly disconnected from the past, however heroically committed to the present. So let me make a few kind of sharper points en route to a conclusion. What I've drawn for you today sounds like a narrative of success, and to some extent, it is. But there are stories that also don't sit easily in this narrative. Most obviously, maybe, there is still much we can say about who isn't represented in this memorial and in the public mind. Most notably, transgendered people still slip through the cracks of human rights legislation and commemoration. Visibility for some has come on the backs of continued invisibility of others. Alice Schwarzer, so adamant to see women represented in the memorial, has been one of the biggest transphobes of the past years, arguing against vital legal reform measures that would make life more livable for trans people. She's been joined in recent years by people like Maria Luisa Fulbrecht, a gender-critical graduate student in biology who regularly takes on trans issues in social media. Fulbrecht was taken to court last year for relativizing the Holocaust by arguing that trans people were not victims of the Nazis. At the same time that this is demoralizing, along with the recent statements of a certain Scottish children's writer similarly denying that trans people were targets of the regime, in 2023, the German parliament officially commemorated gay, lesbian, and transgender victims of the Holocaust as part of the January 27th Holocaust Remembrance Day, which took place on the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Danny Dayan, chairman of Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial, said that while Jews were the Nazis' primary target, he welcomed the broadening of Germany's remembrance culture. The Holocaust was an onslaught against humanity. LGBTQ individuals, Roma and Sinti, mentally disabled persons, but especially against Jewish people. The head of Germany's Central Council of Jews, Josef Schuster, agreed that while the main group of Holocaust victims were Jews, they weren't the only ones. It shows that the development seen in the Nazi period can lead to any societal group being targeted. So this is powerful, especially in the context of transphobia, trying to discredit the truth around other victims and their place in the history of the Holocaust. But we have to remember too, as Anna Heikova's work has shown, it is one thing to recognize gay, lesbian, and trans victims, and another for some folks to think about survivorship in broad and expansive ways. We could go a step further and say that by hinging the memorialization of other victims on discrete, bounded, stable identity categories, we're also committing a bit of a disservice, because people's lives then and now don't easily conform to neat and tidy identity categories. What does it mean that we create a memorial that suggests there is coherence when the historical record presents a much richer, if much more complicated story? Some of the victims of the Nazis were sex workers. Others served in the Wehrmacht or had sex across the age barrier, but were also victimized by the state. How do we communicate that level of complexity to a broad audience when, as we see in the Twitter sphere, memory wars don't care much for empirical truths? But there's more to the story of identity too. When we think solely in terms of siloed identities, we also fail to see the rich history of intersectional stories, or what I've called kinship, to speak to that sense of solidarity that comes from seeing oneself in the plight of others. It is true that there are people who don't want to hear this story. One of the main opponents of including lesbians and trans people as victims works for the Fritz Bauer Institute, which is hard to square because it is itself named after the Jewish German and closeted homosexual jurist who helped bring Adolf Eichmann to trial, and in whose name the Institute studies civil rights in the shadow of the Holocaust. And finally, what are we to make of the fact that memorials like this and initiatives, however inclusive, and indeed we have to celebrate this, are nevertheless viewed by governments and rights organizations to make the argument that we in the West have processed this long and terrible history, while other places in the East lag behind? And indeed, as the work of Jin Haridawarn and Christopher Ewing have shown, many of the debates around the memorial and the kissing youths happened at precisely the same time that heightened activity among mainstream gay and lesbian organizations targeted the supposed homophobia of migrants, going so far as to stage kiss-ins in front of mosques in Berlin, and conducting deeply flawed surveys that neglected to consider that homophobia might also be a homegrown problem and not simply something imported from the outside. And you can see I've blown up this small part of the plaque that's in front of the memorial that talks about Germany's special responsibility to deal with this past, and how it says at the end, because in some places in the world where this hasn't been processed, homosexual love remains illegal and a kiss can be dangerous. And here's just one more example from these actions that had a very specific vision of who they were targeting. And you can see on this slide from the LSPD, that The messaging is first in Turkish, second in Arabic, and third in German. As though there are no hate crimes committed by right-leaning Germans in Berlin, or Brits in London, or Canadians in Montreal or Toronto, or in large and small town America, which we all know is sadly not the reality. So to sum up, instead of lingering over this battle over definitions of persecution as an example of the corrosiveness of identity politics, I've argued it might be more useful to see it as a fraught and ongoing exercise in kinship and placemaking. That is the process by which memory gels and becomes fixed in actual material space. Efforts to make the memorial speak to everyday oppressions, those both in Germany and abroad, afforded it a more fixed, though no less problematic, meaning as a site of reflection, pilgrimage, and memory. Contemporary Berlin's importance as a site of 21st century rights struggles is forged in large part due to its location at the intersection of many different perspectives, often emotionally charged. And yet it is well worth considering what is lost as well as gained in the quest to concretize such a vision of queer consciousness in public memory, especially one that, however heroically committed to the present, continues to make mistakes from its past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. That was incredibly rich, nuanced, but I also think clear lecture that raises lots of wonderful questions and things we can kind of ruminate on now in the Q&A. So what I'm going to ask is that if someone who has a microphone, I mean, I can grab the microphone and we'll just go around and you can ask questions for maybe the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, so are you?
Sure, yeah, that's great.
And also, yeah, let's alternate. We'll take questions from the room and then questions that are online. So let's start with, anyone in the room want to ask a question? Okay, oh, there we go. Dr. Croce.
Lander. Thank you so much. That's a powerful, if chilling presentation with some hope. But I'm going back to a couple of references you made to ways in which it's clear that the Nazis themselves targeted Jews, that as part of their political program, they were a scapegoat. Is there any part of your research that shows not only did they not only persecute Jews, but also these others? Did it affect much of their own political rhetoric? And have we overlooked ways in which they also targeted some of these groups in their language to try to rally support? Did they find other scapegoats?
Do you want to collect or do you want me to answer one-on-one, Eric? What's the best?
Let's start with one at a time,
Sure.
and then if we get a bunch, we'll collect.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question. And I mean, we see the targeting of different groups in different ways over time, right? And so it's a question of how it served the state in certain moments. So when we think about homophobia, so, you know, in the earliest of days, it really served the regime to scapegoat and to target gay men, both because it also allowed them to clean house a little bit in terms of, you know, there was a legacy of youth movement adherents that made their way into some of the Nazi organizations. And so it served their purpose to sort of cleanse the various apparatuses. So the most famous being Ernst Röhm and the SA, right? But then later in the war, you know, the rhetoric, at least the homophobic rhetoric, tends to die down because they actually had to, you know, they had to ensure that some of these men found their way into the military. So some of these gay men were released from their prison sentences and then placed into Wehrmacht sort of death battalions to try to squeeze out every last bit of energy that they may have had for the regime. So it would be wrong to think that the Nazis were impervious to sort of how they came across in public opinion. They were very mindful of public opinion. And so if we just look at something like homophobia, we do see that there are moments over those 15 years when, they were very sure and very public in their animosity. And then there are other moments when they're less public in this way. Much in the same way, Heinrich Himmler is a noted homophobe who has gone on record saying all sorts of awful things. And yet, there were moments behind the lines where homosociality, where, same-sex intimate relationships between men, sexual or otherwise, were sort of part and parcel of what it took to keep a genocidal regime running. Our colleague Thomas Kuhne talks about how male bonding was absolutely essential to, nurturing genocide. And it may not necessarily have always bubbled over into same-sex relationships, but how this is another one of those interesting complexities about sort of our vision of Nazism and then the practicalities of waging a genocidal war. So what I guess the takeaway always is with students and with the general public is what we believe and understand Nazism to be about is actually much more complicated and often much more ambiguous than we've maybe been led to believe.
Thank you, Jen. And just to give an example that shows this even applied to the Jewish question, if you were a Jew of a quarter or half Jewish background, they got desperate enough during the war that they recruited you for the military, even though early on you would have been excluded. So that opportunism, even in their most ideologically fanatical kind of sphere, the Jewish question, could be modified for opportunistic reasons. I think that's an excellent point, Jen. Nothing online so far? Okay, good. So, yeah, okay. Nicole.
Hi, so you briefly brought up Himmler and his, I guess his his very his homophobia. I was just wondering, so I've read some personal artifacts from Himmler and his, I guess, views on homosexuality or whatever he understood that to be at the time. He seemed a lot more he seemed to make this distinction between homosexuality and pedophilia, not to that is kind of blunt, and what he observed to be a sort of homoerotic social factor among men in Germany. Do you have an opinion on that, or how this was viewed at the time?
Yeah, and I mean that's another great example of the kind of moral panic that the Nazis were very keen on fomenting. And so this language of pedophilia, of pederasty, I don't want to say there's a context for it, but there was this legacy of youth movements where we do see kind of this back to the land, almost like Boy Scouts, and some of these actually did find their way. Some of these boys and men found their way into the Nazi hierarchy. And so to some extent this language, this fear, this fixation with pederasty is in a way the sort of Nazi hierarchy trying to sort of enforce a certain sort of standard of behavior. And so as an example, the Schwules Museum in Berlin right now has actually done this exhibition in the last, say, 6 months or so that is looking at sort of sex across the age of majority within some of these 1920s, 1930s movements as a way of trying to sort of air this ugly part of the history in order to sort of, not deny the fact that it was a part and parcel of, some very marginal parts of the gay scene, but to say that this is also part of that difficult history, this difficult past that needs to be talked about in a public and responsible public kind of capacity. So absolutely, this language of pedophilia was very much, weaponized to suit certain sorts of aims, but there is a sort of a history to some of this within the scene as well.
Thank you. So other questions? Yeah, okay.
John, and then. So you mentioned how the Nazis would clean out their quote unquote clean out their organizations like the SA, while also simultaneously promoting homosocial relationships between men. In regards to like the German military at the time, especially during the war, were there any quote unquote incidents of homosexuality within the ranks, like actual homosexual relationships? And if so, how did their higher ups deal with that?
Yeah, this is a great question. And indeed, I mean, that's the other thing that's so interesting about studying this. And I don't want to, sort of fetishize it, right? But there are these different sort of mechanisms for dealing with infractions. And so something like the Gestapo, there is also, the criminal police is policing sort of civilian interactions, right? And then you have military courts that's a sort of a separate arm to deal with these kinds of things among the military. And so there are colleagues who are doing this kind of work, and I look at police and court case files, so Gestapo, right, and civil police units, political police. And there are incidents that can be tracked within the military courts as well. And there were a number of different ways of dealing with it. And the most obvious was, I mean, there was at least the suggestion that any kinds of crimes of this sort within military ranks would result in the death penalty. But we do know that Himmler, wasn't as concerned about policing behavior when, 1943 turns into 44 and turns into 45, and it's very clear that they're going to lose the war. So there were other mechanisms for dealing with soldiers, and one of them was, again, sending them to the front with the hopes of staving off the inevitable. So it's a different sort of way of managing the issue, but it's to say that historians are indeed looking to these records as well when looking at, there's also a really interesting history, I mean, of cross-dressing behind the lines, right? We know this from any scholars of World War I. We know this in terms of American history, Canadian history. And one of my colleagues, Alyssa Mailander, found this fellow, Martin Daumann, who has a personal collection. He went collecting soldiers' photo albums just at flea markets, wherever they surfaced. And what he found was over 1 million snapshots of cross-dressing among the German troops behind the lines. And so Alyssa did this wonderful study of, how do we think about this? I mean, is this trans history, or is this indeed, something else, something separate that involved dressing as women, usually straight men, in order to kind of give a sense of entertainment to men committing acts of genocide. So it shows you that we have to be very careful with how we think about these examples from the past and not just lump them all together as evidence of the same thing. Liddy Backroft's photo and life is a very different thing than, these cross-dressing soldiers of Hitler, who committed genocide. So we have to maintain those differences.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Evans. Thank you for being here today. So my question relates to, since the Nazis' Germany, the SS guards were known for their torture, now not only of Jews, of Polish Jews or German Jews, but also homosexuality. Could there be a possibility, since there is this repulsiveness against homosexuals that the SS guards, that the Nazis were like, they didn't accept them. Could there be a possibility that they would also torture them in order to, I don't know, fix, let's say, but there would also be like this camouflage among these SS guards that they would also be, have homosexuality in order to torture these prisoners as well?
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's a great question. I mean, absolutely, as it's not a surprise to say that the, prisoner experience in general, right, was beyond the pale. And that, that is definitely a common thread through most people's experiences in the camps, and some more than others. And the main difference, as we know, between Jewish victims and other victims is that often if Jews couldn't prove themselves to be productive, then they were simply sent, for eradication, and gay men were worked to death if they were in the camps. So they were sadistically mistreated. There's one memoir by someone named Pierre Zeil. He's a French national who survived, and he was sodomized by SS men in the camps, and he had PTSD for the rest of his life. Yeah, it was it was an unspeakable horror. And then the insult to injury is that these men came out, if they survived, and there was no recognition of their victim status. There was no, there was the sense that they were deserving of the treatment because they had done something to earn their place in those facilities, because they were common criminals. And in fact, the law recognized them as that. I mean, I do a lot of work on the post-war period, and I will look at court cases where, you look at the file and you see the priors, right? You see the prehistory of someone's infractions, and there would be Nazi case files supporting as evidence that this person is a repeat offender. So, this question, 1945 wasn't an end for many gay men, right? It was just a continuity into the post-war period. So that history took a long time to be told, and Germans are coming to terms with that, and it's slowly maybe trickling down into trans experience, which, as I say in the lecture, is there. But isn't it interesting that it's essential to be able to connect yourself to this hideous story of Nazism in order to get sort of public recognition? And that's an interesting thing.
Okay, so question here. So we'll take the next 3 questions. 4, okay. Good, so we'll do 2 over here and then 2 over there. And then we'll see how much time we have left.
Thank you. My main question, I think, is referring to that far-right nationalist who was like in the picture of the men kissing. Like, I know you mentioned it slipped through the cracks, but do you know how exactly that happened? Because I mean, that seems like a pretty big thing to slip through the cracks.
Yeah, I know. It's a good question. It's one of those things where at the time he was just an actor looking for a gig, right? And he, in his own life, he was young. It's not unnatural for, as we know, it's not as though every, gay, lesbian, trans person is necessarily progressive. And so this was a young man who was, open to a job and got that job. And then later in his life, found himself deeper and deeper into this sort of weird pagan, vegan, strange, far right sort of universe. And so it's a really great lesson about our assumptions that people, who live a life must necessarily be on the side of right. And it's not always the case, but it was a huge scandal when it came out, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, my question relates, I think, to this question. It comes back to where you ended your talk, which I understand as an example for a certain instrumentalization of this entire discourse, right? Which is kind of used or placed in the service of other processes of othering, where indeed you have discourses in which far right, extremist right political agendas are now entirely compatible in the US and in Germany with homosexuality, as long as they are kind of used or instrumentalized against migrants. And we have this discourse in Germany on imported homophobia. I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more to that. And I was also interested how your work relates to this concept of homonationalism by Puar. And related to that, we have a parallel discourse, of course, in Germany on the so-called imported anti-Semitism, right? Where basically there is this kind of almost cleansing act of white Germans who built their memorials, purify themselves from these forms of bigotism, but at the same time project them onto the Arab other, right? And really articulate these kinds of campaigns.
Yeah, and that's very much a part of, sounds like a plug, in my book. In my book, I go into that a little bit deeper. And in fact, it is more Jin Harita Warren's amazing work about those very interesting parallels that, this is why I use the kiss. I come back to the kiss over and over again, right? Because it's just so obvious as a symbol in the memorial and then also in these campaigns. what is going on here about who is the offender and where these ideas are located beyond the borders and are being brought into Germany. And, as though it's impossible to imagine that a Muslim person could actually be queer even, right? I mean, this is the thinking. And we all know that that's just not, possible. So I do actually speak to Poir directly around this kind of very homo-nationalist image that, locates the threat somewhere else. And how I try to say in this that we're all sort of complicit in that thinking a little bit, right? When we go there so easily. And it's not to deny that there are homophobes, transphobes everywhere, but it's to say, why is it that it's so easy and so effortless to imagine them from certain places and not from within the cultures like our own that also, spawn them, right? So, I mean, that's very definitely at work. And it's literally around the same time that these kinds of anti-hate mobilizations are being deployed by the same LSPD that is behind the memorial campaign as well. So it's not entirely my argument. It is definitely Jin Harita Warren, who's amazing and did a lot of this work and was shouted down every single time that they raised this issue in Germany in the late 2000s. So yeah, very much a part of this moment.
Excellent. So I promised that we would be done by 8:30. It's almost 8:20. So we'll take these last two questions. But if you really want to follow up tomorrow at 10 a.m. in Lee's Garage, which is right there, right? We'll be having a follow-up discussion with slightly different topic, but you'll be able to discuss in a more kind of dialogical way with Dr. Evans. So that's 10 to 11:15 in Lee's Garage tomorrow morning. So let's take our last two questions. There was one over here.
Hi, what kind of impact has this sort of representation had on some of the living victims and or their family members? Do you feel that any of them, some who may have identified as LGBTQ, but as a direct result of trauma, may have felt the need to continue to hide their sexuality? Do you feel that they have finally felt seen or heard? And are there any specific stories you may have?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And absolutely, a lot of people, men maybe more than women, were forced to hide this because of the legal situation, right? I mean, this is one of those moments where, same-sex love among women is something that is sort of, it's not to say it's hidden in plain sight, but it can kind of be because we often don't sort of, or at least in Germany, it was less easy to sort of spot, to imagine is even possible. So in a way, there's a bit of cover to that, right? Especially if it's not illegal. But for a large number of men, indeed, they had to sort of continue living sort of subterranean lives. And when the memorial was unveiled, just before, a gay survivor came forward, and he was, bazillions of years old. I mean, he was, 80 something, 90, and he had lived his entire, he'd married, he'd had children, and it was not, not surprising that it was when his family had sort of passed on, that he was in the last, era of his own life, that he was able to come forward with this story. And that was a huge surprise to some of the people some of the activist scholars that were doing this work. And, it really proved the importance of doing this. Interestingly, the commemoration of lesbian experience specifically took even longer still to be recognized. And it was a huge battle. So we have the memorial with its kind of wonky attempt to include women's experiences and wonky attempt to maybe bring trans experience in. But it was only in the last few years that we now see a memorial orb. It sounds really weird in English, right? But in German, a memorial kind of ball, a granite ball that was initially seen as a kind of an activist response to commemoration, but it actually now has been officially recognized as marking lesbian experience in the Ravensbrück camp. And this was a very long time coming. So it shows you that commemoration of past crimes is really an ongoing conversation that people have in their contexts. And, it's not all a story of loss. There's obviously been official recognition of trans experiences, but, that is still up for grabs in 2024 on Twitter and in courtrooms in Germany. And, that's something that we all have to contend with, right?
Thank you. One more question? Boy.
So just
Hi.
wanted to ask about often marginalized individuals will have, like openly marginalized people will end up in groups or coalitions or movements, sort of underground groups. Were there any notable or named groups that you know of under the Nazis that are still celebrated today, and how do they tie into the memorial?
You mean underground resistance, like people pushing back, people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, there were, maybe not necessarily as gay, lesbian, trans, for all of these reasons. But we do have interesting examples. It's kind of funny that it was East Germany that actually created a space for kind of working class Jewish resistance fighters, right? And so that's an interesting story, that because of the legacy of state socialism, there was a bit of a space for working class Jewish victims groups that organized, and many of them didn't survive. But that's one kind of example. But for gay, lesbian, trans folks, their stories are, Lori Marhofer, looking into trans histories, has found maybe 150 cases in the law, in the archive. And these are really kind of atomized experiences when you place them next to the experiences of Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and whatever. So it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So the idea of looking for some sort of collective response is just really not where the history is. But instead, it's the stories of Liddy Backcroft, who literally left behind, like cheekily left behind, writings that just declared emphatically who they were. And those are the kinds of stories that speak back to us, I think, when we're looking, through the darkness for something inspiring. It's people like that. And unfortunately, many of them didn't survive. Liddy didn't survive. Yeah.
Okay, so we have one more question.
There we are.
It's going to be
Yeah,
quick.
no worries.
But before we have the question, because after that, we're going to wrap up. Dr. Evans is kind enough to come back over here and sign books after the lecture. So we're going to take our one last question. And then if you want to stick around and buy a book, get it signed, you can. Dr. Houston.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, for this. So you began your talk referencing Confederate memorials. And of course, we know here in Orlando, just south of us, they're working on a memorial for the Pulse victims. And you make this really interesting distinction between history and memory and kind of the creating of memorials. And so I'd be curious to hear from you, kind of based on your research here, what takeaways you might have or even recommendations for communities as they are creating memorials and kind of navigating that tension between history and memory.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I was very aware coming, thinking about what it means to come here, to land in Orlando, right? And how these stories are all very connected in all sorts of ways. And as a Canadian, as a settler in a place where, memory is very fraught, I think the takeaway is to not be afraid of the discord, right? To know that memorials are living spaces and evolving spaces, and they're meant to provoke exchange. And sometimes those conversations are hard and they're painful and they're awful. But that's a way that we process the trauma, right? And I suppose one of the things I love about Germany, even though it's a very difficult place, very, very hard place to be, is that they almost sort of Germans almost wear their they wear their hearts on their sleeves. It's very acrimonious and awful sometimes, and yet there's still a kind of a publicness to the conversation. And I really value that, because I think that that's how we move forward. And it almost has to get ugly before it can get better. And that's not a really hopeful thing to end on, but to hope that there will be brighter days, sometimes we have to go through the darkness, right? Yeah.
Excellent. That's a great place to end. Thank you, Dr. Evans. Let's give her a hand. All right, so